Billionaire catches Maid dancing with his deaf twins. What he did next froze. The late afternoon sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Ashford mansion, casting golden squares across the marble floor of the playroom. Maya Rodriguez moved quietly through the space, her worn sneakers barely making a sound as she gathered scattered toys into their designated bins. After 3 months working as a nanny for the Ashford family, she'd learned that silence wasn't just golden here, it was essential. Alexander Ashford's twin children, Emma and Ethan, sat on the plush carpet, their small fingers moving rapidly through the air in conversation only they could fully understand. At 3 years old, they'd already mastered dozens of signs, communicating in a world that most people around them couldn't access. Maya watched them with a mixture of admiration and heartache. She'd seen the way other staff members struggled to connect with them, offering nervous smiles and exaggerated gestures that the children politely ignored. But Maya was different. She'd spent every spare moment of the past 3 months learning American Sign Language, staying up late with videos and tutorials, practicing until her fingers cramped. Her younger brother had been deaf, and she understood the isolation that came with living in a hearing world that rarely made space for you. Though she'd lost Miguel 5 years ago to an illness, his memory pushed her to be better, to do more for these children who reminded her so much of him. Story time, she signed to the twins, her movements still clumsy but earnest. Emma's face lit up like a sunrise, and Ethan bounced excitedly, both children scrambling to their feet. They'd grown to trust her in ways their father couldn't quite comprehend. Alexander Ashford, for all his billions and business acumen, remained a distant figure in their lives, a man who provided everything material but struggled to bridge the communication gap with his own children. Maya settled onto the carpet between them, pulling out a picture book. But before she could begin, Emma tugged at her sleeve and pointed to the corner of the room where a small speaker sat. The little girl had recently developed a fascination with vibrations, placing her hands on speakers to feel the music her ears couldn't process. An idea sparked in Maya's mind. She pulled out her phone and selected a song, one with a strong, rhythmic bass that would create vibrations the children could feel. As the music began, she placed Emma's and Ethan's hands on the speaker, watching their expressions transform into wonder. Then Maya did something she'd never done during work hours. She began to dance. Not the balletic, refined movements one might expect in a billionaire's home, but the kind of uninhibited, joyful dancing she'd done with Miguel in their tiny apartment, where they'd turn up the bass so he could feel every beat. She exaggerated her movements, making them big and expressive, and began signing along with the rhythm, creating a visual language of pure happiness. Emma giggled, a sound so rare it made Maya's heart soar. Ethan immediately jumped up, mimicking her movements with the uncoordinated enthusiasm of a toddler. Soon all 3 of them were spinning, jumping, and laughing in a bubble of shared joy that transcended the need for hearing. Maya signed as she danced. Happy. Music. Feel the rhythm in your heart. The children understood. They didn't need to hear the melody to feel the emotion, to sense the beat through the floorboards, to see the joy on Maya's face. For those precious minutes, they weren't deaf children in a world designed for hearing people. They were just kids, dancing with someone who truly saw them. What Maya didn't know was that Alexander Ashford had returned home early from a business meeting in Manhattan. He'd been doing that more often lately, though he couldn't quite articulate why. Perhaps it was the nagging guilt that his company had become his refuge from the challenges waiting at home. Perhaps it was the growing realization that his children were growing up without him truly knowing them. He stood in the doorway of the playroom, completely frozen. The scene before him was so foreign to everything he knew about his own home that it took several moments for his brain to process what he was seeing. His children, his usually quiet, reserved children who often seemed lost in their own world, were laughing. Actually laughing. Emma's face was flushed with happiness, her small body moving without self-consciousness. Ethan had his arms stretched wide, spinning in circles until he was dizzy. And at the center of it all was Maya, the nanny he'd barely spoken to beyond initial instructions and the occasional brief check-in. She was dancing with an abandon that seemed almost unprofessional, yet somehow perfectly right. Her hands moved through the air in patterns he didn't recognize, her face animated with an expression of pure joy. Alexander's throat tightened unexpectedly. When was the last time he'd seen his children this happy? When was the last time he'd made them laugh like this? The answer came to him with uncomfortable clarity. Never. In the 2 years since his wife Lauren had died, leaving him alone with 2 infant children whose deafness had been diagnosed just months before her passing, he'd been surviving rather than living. He'd thrown himself into work, hired the best specialists, enrolled the twins in early intervention programs, but he'd kept himself at an emotional distance. He told himself it was because he didn't know how to communicate with them, that he was waiting until they were older, and he could learn sign language properly. But watching Maya now, this woman who made barely above minimum wage and had probably learned signing on her own time, he realized he'd been lying to himself. He'd been afraid. Afraid of not being enough. Afraid of failing them the way he felt he'd failed their mother, who'd begged him to spend more time with the family in those final months. Afraid of the vulnerability that came with truly connecting with another person. The song changed, and Maya caught sight of him. The joy on her face flickered, replaced by panic. She immediately stopped dancing, her hands dropping to her sides, her professional mask sliding back into place. "Mr. Ashford, I'm so sorry, I was just," she stammered. But Alexander held up a hand, surprising himself with what came out of his mouth. "Don't stop. Please." The words hung in the air between them, and Maya felt her heart hammering against her ribs. In the 3 months she'd worked for Alexander Ashford, she'd barely exchanged more than polite greetings with the man. He was always rushing off to meetings, his phone perpetually attached to his ear, his perfectly tailored suits and intense blue eyes creating an aura of untouchable authority. Now, standing in the doorway with his tie loosened and something vulnerable in his expression, he looked almost human. Emma noticed her father first. The little girl's face shifted from joy to cautious neutrality, an expression no 3-year-old should have mastered. She moved closer to Maya, her small hand finding the nanny's fingers. Ethan followed his sister's lead, his earlier exuberance dimming like a candle being covered. The change in the children broke something open in Alexander's chest. They were afraid of him. Not in a physical sense, he'd never raised a hand to them. But they'd learned that his presence meant the end of joy, the return to a quiet, careful existence where they were seen but not truly engaged with. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said, his voice rougher than intended. He cleared his throat. "You were teaching them to dance?" Maya's grip on the children's hands tightened protectively. She'd heard stories from other household staff about wealthy parents who objected to their methods, who saw any deviation from rigid schedules as unprofessional. She needed this job desperately. Her mother's medical bills were piling up, and positions that paid this well were rare for someone without a college degree. "I apologize, Mr. Ashford. It won't happen again. I should have been doing the structured activities in their schedule."
"No."
He stepped into the room, and Maya noticed for the first time how exhausted he looked beneath the expensive veneer. There were shadows under his eyes, and his shoulders carried a weight that seemed to have nothing to do with physical burden. "I mean, no, that's not what I want to understand. How did you do that? How did you make them so happy?" The genuine confusion in his voice made Maya pause. She'd assumed he was distant by choice, that he simply didn't care enough to try. But watching him look at his children with a mixture of longing and bewilderment, she realized he was lost. "I learned a sign," she said simply. "And I pay attention to what makes them feel included rather than accommodated." "What's the difference?" Maya considered her words carefully. Accommodation is doing things for them. Inclusion is doing things with them. The music, they can't hear it, but they can feel the vibrations. And the dancing isn't about the sound. It's about the joy of movement and the connection between us. I sign the emotions, not just the words. They understand that I'm happy to be with them, not just performing a duty. Alexander moved closer, watching as Ethan signed something to Emma. The twins had their own shorthand, a mix of ASL and made-up gestures that only they fully understood. "I've been taking online ASL courses," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "For 6 months. But I can't seem to. They don't respond to me the way they do to you. Maya saw the vulnerability in his confession and felt her professional guard lowering slightly. May I ask you something, Mr. Ashford? He nodded, and she noticed he'd crouched down to the children's level, though neither twin approached him. When you signed to them, what are you thinking about? The question clearly caught him off guard. I'm thinking about getting it right. Making sure my hand shapes are correct, that I'm following proper grammar structure. And when I signed to them, Maya said gently, I'm thinking about how much I love them. How funny Ethan is when he makes that face when he tastes something sour. How Emma hums to herself when she's concentrating, even though she can't hear her own voice. I'm thinking about connecting, not performing. Alexander's jaw tightened, and for a moment Maya worried she'd overstepped. Then Emma did something that shocked everyone in the room. She let go of Maya's hand and walked slowly toward her father. The little girl studied his face with a serious intensity only a toddler could muster. Then she raised her small hands and signed something. Alexander's eyes widened. She asked if you're sad. Maya translated softly, though Alexander had understood the simple sign. He looked at his daughter, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in months. Yes, he signed back, his movements careful. Daddy is sad. Emma considered this, then signed again. Why? The simple question unraveled something in Alexander. How could he explain to a 3-year-old that he was sad because he'd let fear and guilt build walls between them? That he missed their mother so much it physically hurt, and that looking at their faces, Lauren's eyes, Lauren's smile, sometimes felt like too much to bear? Because he signed slowly, I miss your mama, and I'm scared. Maya's breath caught. She'd known about Lauren Ashford's death. Of course, the whole staff had known. Cancer, they'd whispered. So young, barely 30. The twins had been only 1 year old when she'd passed. Maya had seen a portrait of Lauren in the hallway, a beautiful woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, holding newborn twins with a look of fierce, protective love. Scared of what? Emma signed back. Alexander's hands trembled. Scared that I don't know how to be a good daddy to you. The honesty of it hung in the air. Ethan, watching the exchange, slowly approached his sister's side. He looked at his father, then signed something that made Alexander's eyes shine with unshed tears. What did he say? Alexander asked Maya, his voice breaking. He said, practice, like Emma and me practice walking. We fall down, but we get up. The simple wisdom of a 3-year-old hit Alexander like a physical blow. He'd been so afraid of failing that he'd never really tried. He'd hidden behind work, behind specialists and therapists and nannies, telling himself that providing for them was enough. Without thinking, he opened his arms, a universal gesture that needed no translation. For a long moment, neither twin moved. Then Emma stepped forward, and Ethan followed. They let their father embrace them, and though the hug was awkward and brief, it was a beginning. When they pulled back, Emma signed to Maya, teach Daddy to dance. Maya looked at Alexander, whose expression was a mixture of hope and terror. I don't think, he started, but Maya interrupted him. Mr. Ashford, when was the last time you did something just for joy? Not for business, not for productivity, but just because it made you happy? He couldn't remember. The realization was stark and uncomfortable. The twins need therapy and structure and education, Maya continued, but they also need to see that life can be joyful. That being deaf doesn't mean being less than. And honestly, sir, with all due respect, you need that too. For a long moment, Alexander was silent. Then he did something that surprised even himself. He laughed. It was a rusty sound, as if his body had forgotten how. You're right, he said. I don't know if I remember how to just be happy. Then it's a good thing you have 3 excellent teachers, Maya said, gesturing to the twins and herself. She restarted the music, placing Alexander's hand on the speaker so he could feel what his children felt, the vibration, the rhythm that transcended sound. Emma took one of his hands, Ethan took the other, and Maya began to demonstrate the simple, joyful movements she'd been doing. Alexander felt ridiculous. He was a CEO, a man who commanded boardrooms and made million-dollar decisions. He'd graduated from Harvard Business School at the top of his class. And here he was, bouncing awkwardly to music he could barely hear, following the lead of his children and their nanny. But then Emma laughed, that beautiful, rare sound, and Ethan signed, happy, with such enthusiasm that his whole body shook. And Alexander realized that this moment, absurd as it felt, was the most important thing he'd done in years. Maya watched the scene with tears threatening to spill over. This was why she'd become a nanny despite her mother's insistence that she could do better. This moment right here, watching a family begin to heal, seeing children light up with joy, knowing she played even a small part in bringing them together. The dance continued until all four of them collapsed on the carpet, breathless and grinning. Emma curled up against her father's side, and Ethan sprawled across his lap. It was the most physical affection Alexander had received from his children in months, and he was terrified to move, afraid of breaking the spell. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Alexander couldn't suddenly become the father his children needed just because of one afternoon of dancing. But something fundamental had shifted in him, like a rusty door finally being forced open to let in light. The next morning, he did something unprecedented. He called his assistant and cleared his schedule for the entire day. Sandra's shocked silence on the other end of the phone would have been comical if Alexander hadn't been so nervous about what he was planning. "The entire day, Mr. Ashford?" she'd asked, her professional tone barely concealing her surprise. "But you have the meeting with the Japanese investors and the board review, and—" "Reschedule everything," he'd said firmly. "Family emergency." It wasn't technically an emergency, but it felt like one. He'd woken up at 3 in the morning with a sudden, terrifying realization that Emma and Ethan would only be 3 years old once. That every day he spent behind his desk was a day he could never get back with them. The thought had sent him to his home office, where he'd spent hours researching deaf culture, watching signing videos, and reading articles about parenting deaf children. He'd learned things that should have been obvious, but had never quite penetrated his awareness, that many deaf people didn't view their deafness as a disability to be fixed, but as a different way of experiencing the world. That sign language wasn't just manual English, but a rich, complex language with its own grammar and cultural context. That his children, if raised with the right support and pride in their identity, could live full, successful, joyful lives. But more than anything, he'd learned that he'd been approaching their deafness all wrong, as a problem to be managed rather than an aspect of who they were to be celebrated. When Maya arrived for work that morning, she found Alexander in the kitchen, attempting to make pancakes while simultaneously watching a signing video on his tablet. The kitchen was a disaster. Flour dusted the countertops, a bowl of batter had been knocked over, and smoke was coming from one of the burners. "Mr. Ashford." Maya rushed forward, turning off the stove and waving away the smoke. "What are you doing?" He looked at her sheepishly, and she noticed he was wearing jeans and a t-shirt instead of his usual suit, a pair of clothes that looked so expensive they'd probably cost more than her monthly rent. But still, it was the most casual she'd ever seen him. "I'm attempting to cook breakfast for my children," he said. Emphasis on attempting. "How do you make these every morning?" "This is impossible." Despite herself, Maya laughed. "You use the griddle, not the stovetop burners. And you don't crack the eggs directly into the flour. Did you even look at a recipe?" "I was trying to watch the signing video at the same time," he admitted, gesturing to the tablet where a cheerful woman was demonstrating food-related signs. "I wanted to be able to sign breakfast and pancake and do you want syrup when they woke up." Maya felt her heart soften despite her professional instincts telling her to maintain boundaries. "That's actually really thoughtful, Mr. Ashford." "Alexander," he corrected her. "If we're going to be covered in pancake batter together, you might as well call me Alexander." "I don't think that's appropriate, sir." "Nothing about this situation is appropriate," he said, gesturing at the destroyed kitchen. "But I'm done caring about appropriate. I'm trying to care about effective, about real, about being the father they deserve." Before Maya could respond, 2 small figures appeared in the kitchen doorway. Emma and Ethan, still in their pajamas, stared at the scene with wide eyes. Their father, In the kitchen, covered in flour, without a suit or tie in sight, it was so outside their normal experience that they seemed unsure how to react. Alexander crouched down to their level, his movements still uncertain but genuine. "Good morning," he signed, the gesture slow but clear. "I'm making breakfast. Want to help?" The twins looked at each other, having one of their silent conversations. Then Emma signed back, "You're home." The simple observation carried weight. Alexander was always gone before they woke up, returned after they were in bed. His presence at breakfast was so anomalous that Emma felt the need to state it as a fact, as if confirming it was real. "I'm home," Alexander confirmed, signing carefully. "I'm going to be home more. I want to spend time with you. With both of you." Ethan signed something, and Maya translated. "He's asking if you have to go to work." "Not today," Alexander signed. "Today is for us. For family." Emma approached cautiously, like a wild animal deciding whether to trust a human offering food. She looked up at her father with those serious eyes, Lauren's eyes, and signed, "You'll stay?" The question broke Alexander's heart because it revealed how little trust his children had in his presence. He'd made promises before, rare occasions when he'd committed to being home for dinner or attending a therapy session, only to be called away by a crisis at work that, in retrospect, could have been handled by someone else. "I'll stay," he signed, and then added in both sign and speech, "I promise." What followed was the most chaotic and wonderful morning Alexander had experienced since his children were born. Emma and Ethan, under Maya's patient guidance, helped make a new batch of pancake batter. They couldn't reach the counter even on stools, so Alexander lifted them up one at a time, letting them pour ingredients while Maya supervised. Ethan got flour in his hair and found it hilarious, signing snow and giggling. Emma insisted on cracking her own egg and got shell in the mixture, but instead of being frustrated, Alexander just carefully fished it out and told her she did a great job trying. Maya showed them how to test if the griddle was hot enough by dropping a bit of water on it and watching it sizzle, and the twins were fascinated by the science of it. They sat down to eat their slightly lumpy, irregularly shaped pancakes, and Alexander couldn't remember food ever tasting better. Emma signed that she wanted more syrup, and Ethan signed that his was yummy, and Alexander felt a swell of pride at understanding his children's communication without Maya's translation. After breakfast, as Maya began to clean up, Alexander stopped her. "Leave it," he said. "I'll clean it later. I want you to teach me more. The dancing, the games, the things you do with them that make them so happy. I want to learn." Maya hesitated. "Mr. Ashford, Alexander, I'm not a specialist. I don't have any formal training in deaf education. I'm just a nanny who's trying to—" "You're not just anything," Alexander interrupted her. "In 3 months, you've connected with my children in ways I haven't managed in 3 years. Whatever you're doing, it's working. Please, teach me." So Maya did. She showed him the finger plays she'd adapted to be more visual, the games that relied on vibration and touch rather than sound, the ways she'd learned to make every moment an opportunity for communication. She demonstrated how she always positioned herself so the children could see her face and hands clearly, how she used facial expressions to convey meaning and emotion, how she celebrated their successes and made them feel proud of who they were. Alexander watched his children engage with Maya and slowly began to understand what he'd been missing. It wasn't just about learning signs, though that was important. It was about presence, about being fully engaged in the moment instead of half distracted by his phone or his thoughts about work. It was about joy and play and letting his children see him as a human being with emotions rather than a distant authority figure. During a break while the twins played with blocks, Maya shared something she'd been hesitant to mention. "There's a deaf community center in the city," she said. "They have parent-child classes, events, story times in ASL. I've been taking Emma and Ethan to some of the toddler groups." Alexander's head snapped up. "You have? Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't think you'd be interested," Maya admitted. "Most of the parents in the group are deaf themselves, or have deaf family members. I wasn't sure if you'd want to be around. I mean, I didn't know if I'd be comfortable around deaf adults." Alexander finished for her. "I wouldn't have been. A few months ago, I would have made excuses about being too busy. But you're right, I need to be part of their world, not just expect them to adapt to mine. Maya pulled out her phone and showed him pictures from the community center, Emma and Ethan playing with other deaf children, signing animatedly to each other. His children, beaming with confidence in a space where their way of communicating was the norm, not the exception. They're different there, Alexander observed, his voice thick with emotion. More confident. More themselves. Because they're not the ones who are different there, Maya explained. They're just kids. And the deaf adults they meet show them what their future can look like, successful, happy people who happen to be deaf. Alexander made a decision in that moment. I want to go to the next class or event or whatever is happening. With them. With you, if you're willing to help me navigate it. There's a family story time this Saturday, Maya said. 10 in the morning. It's casual. Parents and kids sitting on the floor, stories told in ASL, songs signed. Emma and Ethan love it. We'll be there, Alexander said firmly. The rest of the day passed in a blur of new experiences for Alexander. He read picture books to his children, signing the stories with Maya's help. He played with them in the backyard, discovering that Emma loved to collect leaves and Ethan was fascinated by ants. He gave them their bath, something he'd always left to the night nurse, and nearly flooded the bathroom when Ethan splashed enthusiastically. As evening approached and the twins began to show signs of tiredness, Alexander carried Emma to her bed while Maya brought Ethan. The children's bedroom was beautiful, designed by an expensive interior decorator with soft colors and every possible amenity. But Alexander realized he'd barely spent any time in it. He'd never done bedtime routine before. He watched as Maya helped the children brush their teeth, put on their pajamas, and settle into their beds. Then she signed. Story time. Do you want Daddy to tell you a story? Both children looked uncertain, but Emma nodded slowly. Alexander's mind raced. He didn't know any stories in sign language. But then he remembered something Lauren used to do before she got too sick, reading their favorite picture book by making up silly voices and exaggerated expressions. He sat between their beds and began to tell them a story about a brave knight and a friendly dragon, making up the plot as he went along. His signing was clumsy, and he had to fingerspell words he didn't know the signs for, but Maya helped fill in the gaps. More importantly, he put emotion into it, making faces, using his body to show the dragon's size, signing scared and brave and happy with genuine feeling. Emma and Ethan watched, entranced. When the story ended with the knight and dragon becoming friends, Ethan signed more, but his eyes were already drooping. Tomorrow, Alexander signed. I'll tell you another story tomorrow. Promise. Emma signed, and Alexander recognized the sign from earlier that morning. I promise, he signed back, and this time he understood the weight of that promise. These children had learned not to trust the word of adults who disappeared. He would have to prove, through consistent action, that his promise meant something. As he and Maya left the room, Alexander felt emotionally exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with work stress. This was the fatigue of being fully present, of engaging his heart instead of just his mind. Thank you, he said to Maya as they stood in the hallway. For today. For everything you've been doing for them. I don't think I've ever properly thanked you. You're welcome, Maya said softly. They're easy to love, you know. Emma and Ethan. They're such special kids. They are, Alexander agreed. And I've been taking them for granted. Taking you for granted. He paused, then added, I want to change things. My schedule, my priorities, my whole approach. But I'm going to need help. Would you? I know this is beyond your job description, but would you be willing to teach me? Not just the signing, but all of it. How to be present with them. How to make them feel loved and valued. Maya looked at this powerful man standing before her, vulnerable and asking for help, and she thought about Miguel. Her brother would have loved to have a father who cared this much, who was willing to learn and change. Yes, she said. I'll help you. Saturday morning arrived with a kind of nervous energy that reminded Alexander of his first day at Harvard. He'd changed clothes 3 times, unsure what one wore to a deaf community center story time. His first choice, a business casual button-down and slacks, seemed too formal. The second, designer jeans and a polo, felt like he was trying too hard. He'd finally settled on simple jeans and a comfortable sweater, but he still felt like an imposter preparing to enter a world where he didn't belong. Maya arrived to pick them up at 9:30, and Alexander noticed she'd chosen to drive her own car rather than use one of his vehicles. Her 12-year-old Honda looked out of place in his circular driveway, surrounded by his Mercedes, Tesla, and Range Rover, but there was something honest about it that he appreciated. "The twins love car rides in your car," Maya explained as she helped buckle Emma into her car seat. "They say it smells like French fries and vanilla air freshener, and that makes them happy." Alexander couldn't remember the last time he'd driven either of his children anywhere. Usually, his driver took them to therapy appointments or the nanny drove them in the Range Rover. Another small failure to add to his growing list. The drive to the community center took them through neighborhoods Alexander rarely visited, not dangerous areas, but working-class sections of the city where people lived in modest homes and shopped at discount stores. He'd grown up in Manhattan's Upper East Side, attended private schools, and existed in a bubble of wealth that he'd never really examined. "I used to live near here," Maya said as they passed a small playground. "Before I started working for you. My mom and I had a 2-bedroom apartment on 5th Street. Had. Alexander caught the past tense. "I moved us to a better place after I'd been working for you for 2 months, Maya admitted. "Somewhere with air conditioning that actually works and a bathroom that doesn't leak. Your salary made that possible. I've been meaning to thank you for that." Alexander felt uncomfortable with her gratitude. He paid her well by nanny standards, but he knew it was nothing compared to what he spent on his suits or wine or the monthly maintenance on his cars. The disparity felt obscene suddenly. The community center was housed in a converted church, its brick facade warm and welcoming despite the building's age. A rainbow flag hung beside the entrance alongside a sign that read, "Everyone welcome," in both English and ASL. As they approached, Alexander could see families entering, some signing to each other, others speaking, children of all ages running ahead of their parents. "Nervous?" Maya asked, catching his expression. "Terrified," Alexander admitted. "What if I can't communicate? What if they judge me for being a hearing parent who can barely sign? What if? What if you just try?" Maya interrupted gently. "Nobody here expects perfection. They just want to see parents who care about being part of their children's world. That's all." Inside, the center was bustling with activity. The main room had been set up with cushions and blankets on the floor, creating a cozy space for story time. Parents and children were already gathering, finding spots and greeting each other with signs and smiles. Alexander felt dozens of eyes turn toward him as they entered, and his instinct was to pull out his phone and pretend to be busy with important business. Instead, he held Emma's hand a little tighter and followed Maya's lead. A woman approached them, late 40s, with kind eyes and confident hand movements that immediately identified her as a fluent signer. She signed something to Maya, who translated. "This is Patricia. She's the director here. She's saying welcome, and she's glad we came today." Alexander attempted to sign back. "Thank you. Nice to meet you." But his hand shapes were clumsy. Patricia smiled warmly and signed slowly in return, exaggerating her movements so he could follow. "She says not to worry about making mistakes," Maya translated. "That's how we all learn. And she's thanking you for bringing the twins. She says Emma and Ethan are wonderful children." Pride swelled in Alexander's chest, not the kind he felt when his company won an industry award, but something deeper and more meaningful. A stranger was praising his children, not for what they could become, but for who they were right now. More families arrived, and Alexander noticed the diversity of the group. There were deaf parents with deaf children, hearing parents with deaf children, mixed families, single parents, grandparents. One couple looked to be in their 20s, signing animatedly to their toddler. An older man sat in the corner, a baby in his lap, using exaggerated facial expressions that made the infant giggle. Emma and Ethan spotted friends from previous visits and immediately ran off to join them. Alexander's first instinct was to call them back, to keep them close, but Maya put a gentle hand on his arm. "Let them be kids," she said. "They're safe here. Watch." So Alexander watched. He watched his children, his reserved, cautious children, transform into social butterflies. Emma was showing another little girl how to sign butterfly, both children's hands fluttering through the air. Ethan was engaged in some kind of game with two other boys, all three of them laughing silently but expressively. "That's Marcus and David," Maya explained, pointing to the boys with Ethan. "Their parents are both deaf. And that's Sarah with Emma. Her mom is hearing, like me, but her dad is deaf. She's been teaching Emma some of the slang signs that kids use." "Slang?" Alexander asked, surprised. "ASL isn't just a language, it's a living, evolving culture," Maya explained. "There are regional differences, generational gaps, even deaf slang. The kids here are growing up bilingual and bicultural in ways that will enrich their whole lives." Before Alexander could respond, Patricia called everyone to attention by flashing the lights, a common way to get the attention of deaf individuals. Everyone settled onto the cushions, children in front and parents behind them. Emma and Ethan found spots near the front, and Alexander sat behind them, acutely aware of how little he understood of the signed conversations happening around him. The story time began, and Alexander was immediately captivated. The storyteller, a young deaf woman named Jessica, didn't just sign the words. She became the story. Her face transformed to show each character's emotions. Her body moved to indicate movement and size. Her hands painted pictures in the air that transcended the need for spoken language. She was telling a story about a deaf prince who could communicate with animals through sign language and who used this gift to save his kingdom from a terrible storm. The children were mesmerized, their eyes tracking every movement. When Jessica signed the howling wind, her whole body conveyed the power of the storm. When the prince signed to the birds to help him, her hands showed the gentle communication between them. Alexander understood maybe 20% of the actual signs, but he understood 100% of the emotion and story. It was beautiful in a way he'd never experienced before, pure communication that didn't rely on sound, that existed in a visual and emotional space he'd never known existed. Halfway through the story, Emma turned around to make sure her father was still there. When she saw him watching intently, she smiled, a real, genuine smile, and then turned back to the story. That small gesture of checking, of caring that he was there, meant more to Alexander than any business success ever had. After the story ended, Patricia announced that there would be a parent discussion group in the adjacent room while the kids had supervised playtime. Alexander's anxiety spiked again. He'd have to try to communicate without Maya translating every word, but he followed the other parents. The discussion group was led by a deaf father named Marcus, who Patricia introduced as a successful software engineer and father of three. Marcus began signing, and Patricia, who was hearing but a certified interpreter, voiced for those who needed it. Today's topic, Marcus signed, is dealing with the guilt of being a hearing parent of a deaf child. Alexander felt like Marcus was speaking directly to him. Around the circle, other parents nodded in recognition. A woman signed, "I felt guilty that my daughter couldn't hear my voice telling her I loved her." Another parent added, "I felt guilty that I didn't catch the deafness earlier, that maybe if we'd started intervention sooner." "I felt guilty," signed a father, "that I saw her deafness as something broken that needed fixing." The confessions continued, each parent sharing their shame, their fears, their moments of grief for the child they'd imagined versus the child they had. And through it all, Marcus listened with empathy and understanding. When it was Alexander's turn, his hands shook as he attempted to sign. His ASL was too limited for what he wanted to say, so Patricia voiced as he spoke, "I feel guilty for every day I've wasted. For building walls instead of bridges. For hiding behind work because I was afraid of not being enough for them. For making them feel like their deafness was an inconvenience to me rather than just a part of who they are." His voice cracked on the last words, and he felt tears he'd been holding back for years threatening to fall. These strangers in this converted church knew him better than his board of directors, better than his wealthy friends, better than perhaps anyone except Maya. Marcus signed in response, and Patricia translated, "That guilt you feel? It shows you care. It shows you want to do better." But don't let it become a wall too. Use it as motivation, then let it go. Your children don't need a perfect parent. They need a present one. After the discussion, as parents collected their children, several people approached Alexander. A deaf mother whose teenage daughter was thriving in a mainstream high school signed encouragement. A hearing father who'd been where Alexander was 5 years ago offered his phone number and an invitation to coffee. A deaf couple whose son was Emma's friend invited them to a family barbecue next month. Alexander accepted each offer with gratitude, feeling like he'd found a community he didn't know he'd been missing. These people understood challenges he'd thought were unique to him. They'd walked this path before, and they were offering to help him walk it too. As they loaded back into Maya's car, Emma signed her father. Fun? Yes, Alexander signed back. Very fun. We'll come back next week. Both twins nodded enthusiastically, and Alexander felt another piece of his heart click into place. This was what had been missing, not just communication with his children, but connection to a whole community that could support them all. On the drive home, with the twins drowsy in their car seats, Alexander asked Maya, "Why didn't you tell me about all this sooner? The community center, the other families, all of it." Maya was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Honestly, I didn't think you'd care. You seemed so focused on therapy and medical intervention and preparing them for a hearing world. I wasn't sure you'd understand the value of deaf culture and community." "I didn't understand," Alexander admitted. "I thought I was doing right by them by hiring the best therapists, getting the best cochlear implant surgeons on standby, doing everything I could to help them overcome their deafness. But I was treating it like a business problem to be solved instead of an identity to be celebrated." "And now?" Maya asked. "Now I realize I've been the one with the handicap," Alexander said. "I've been deaf to what my children really needed, blind to the beautiful world they're part of. And you opened my eyes, Maya. You, and that day you were dancing with them. You showed me what I've been missing." As they pulled into the mansion's driveway, Alexander made another decision. "Maya, I want to propose something. I want to hire a deaf educator to work with the family. Not instead of you, you're irreplaceable, but in addition. Someone who can teach all of us more about deaf culture, advanced ASL, everything. Would you be willing to help me find someone?" "I know someone perfect," Maya said immediately. "My brother's best friend, Marcus, different Marcus from the community center, is a certified deaf educator. He's been working at a school for the deaf, but he's been looking for a private position. He's deaf himself, grew up in the community, and he's amazing with kids. Can you reach out to him?" Alexander asked. "I want to do this right." That evening, after the twins were in bed, Alexander sat in his home office, not to work, but to reflect. He pulled out his phone and looked at photos from the day. Maya had snapped a few pictures. Emma and Ethan laughing during story time, Alexander sitting among other parents in the discussion group, the twins playing with their friends. In every photo, his children looked happy, confident, comfortable in their own skin in a way they never seemed at home. He thought about the deaf adults he'd met today, successful, happy people living full lives. Patricia, the center director, had a master's degree in social work. Marcus, the discussion leader, was a software engineer who'd shown Alexander photos of his adventurous hiking trips. Jessica, the storyteller, was completing her PhD in deaf studies. These weren't people who'd overcome their deafness. They were people who'd embraced it, built communities around it, and thrived. And they were showing Alexander what his children's future could look like if he gave them the right foundation. His phone buzzed with an email from Sandra, his assistant. "Investors asking about next week's schedule. Confirming you'll be available?" Alexander stared at the email for a long moment. His old self would have immediately confirmed, would have already been thinking about the presentation, the numbers, the strategy. But that Alexander had missed 3 years of his children's lives. That Alexander had been slowly destroying his family while building his fortune. He typed back, "Block out every morning until 11 a.m. That time is reserved for family and is non-negotiable. No exceptions." The response came quickly. "Understood. Anything else?" "Yes," Alexander typed. "I need to hire additional staff. Looking for a deaf educator for private family consultation. Salary negotiable. Can you post the listing? As he hit send, Alexander felt like he was finally making decisions that mattered. The business would survive with him being slightly less available. His children wouldn't survive, at least not as whole, happy people, if he continued on the path he'd been on. He walked to the twins' room and quietly opened the door. Emma and Ethan were sleeping, Emma clutching the stuffed butterfly she'd been playing with earlier, Ethan sprawled out in his typical starfish position. They looked peaceful, innocent, perfect. "I'm going to do better," Alexander whispered into the darkness, even though they couldn't hear him. "I promise. Starting now, I'm going to be the father you deserve." He closed the door softly and went to find Maya, who was in the kitchen preparing lunches for tomorrow. When he entered, she looked up in surprise. "I've been thinking," Alexander said, "about everything, and I've realized I need to make some major changes. To my schedule, my priorities, to this whole household." Maya set down the sandwich she was making and gave him her full attention. "I want to restructure how we do things here," Alexander continued. "I want sign language to be the primary language of this house for everyone. I want deaf culture to be celebrated, not treated as something to work around. I want Emma and Ethan to grow up proud of who they are." "That's wonderful, Alexander," Maya said. "Really? But what does that mean practically?" "It means I want to hire Marcus, if he's interested. It means I want to host events here for other families from the community center. It means I want to learn from you, from Marcus, from every deaf adult who's willing to teach me. And it means—" He paused, gathering courage for what he was about to say next. "It means I want you to be more than just a nanny. I want you to be part of our family, truly. Not as an employee, but as someone we rely on, someone whose input matters in every decision we make about the twins." Maya's eyes widened. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Alexander said simply. "Say you'll help me transform this house from a place where two deaf children are accommodated into a home where they're celebrated. Say you'll be patient with me while I learn. Say you'll call me out when I slip back into old patterns. Just say yes." Maya thought about her mother, who'd raised her alone after her father left, who'd worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat, who'd taught her that family wasn't just about blood, it was about who showed up, who stayed, who loved you even when it was hard. "Yes," Maya said. "I'll help you. We'll figure it out together." Alexander's relief was palpable. "Thank you. For everything. For seeing my children when I was too blind to see them myself. For not giving up on this family. Those kids are easy to love," Maya said again, echoing her words from earlier in the week. "And, honestly, I think you are too. You just needed someone to show you how." The transformation of the Ashford household began in earnest the following week. Marcus Chun, Maya's friend and a certified deaf educator, arrived for his interview on Monday morning. Alexander found himself uncharacteristically nervous about the meeting. This was perhaps the most important hiring decision he'd made in years, and for once, it had nothing to do with quarterly profits or market share. Marcus was in his early 30s, dressed professionally but comfortably in khaki pants and a button-down shirt. He had an easy smile and confident demeanor that immediately put Alexander at ease. More importantly, Emma and Ethan's faces lit up when they saw him. Apparently, they'd met him briefly at community center events, though Alexander hadn't been there to see it. The interview, conducted through Patricia's interpreting services via video call, was unlike any job interview Alexander had conducted. Instead of asking about qualifications and experience, he found himself asking questions like, "How do I help my children be proud of who they are?" And "What mistakes do hearing parents typically make that I should avoid?" Marcus answered each question with thoughtful consideration. Through the interpreter, he explained, "The biggest mistake hearing parents make is viewing deafness through a lens of loss rather than difference. They mourn the child who can hear instead of celebrating the child they have. Your children don't need to be fixed. They need to be supported, educated, and given access to a rich linguistic and cultural heritage that you probably didn't even know existed." "I didn't," Alexander admitted. "Until last Saturday, I didn't understand that there was a whole culture, a whole community. I've been treating Emma and Ethan's deafness as a medical condition rather than an identity. Marcus signed something with particular emphasis, and the interpreter translated. The fact that you're willing to admit that and change is huge. Many hearing parents never get there. They spend their children's whole lives trying to make them more normal, more like hearing children, and their kids grow up feeling like they're never good enough as they are. The words hit Alexander like a punch to the gut. Was that what he'd been doing? Making his children feel like they weren't good enough? Marcus must have seen something in Alexander's expression because he signed again. But you're here now. You're making changes now. That's what matters. Children are remarkably resilient and forgiving when they see genuine effort from their parents. By the end of the interview, Alexander had offered Marcus a position that was part educator, part cultural consultant, and part family counselor. Marcus would work with the entire household 3 days a week, teaching ASL to Alexander and the staff who were interested, helping integrate deaf cultural practices into daily life, and working directly with Emma and Ethan on age-appropriate language and social development. Marcus accepted on the spot, signing, "I'm honored to be part of your family's journey. These children deserve a childhood where they feel proud and empowered, and I think together we can give them that." The changes started immediately. Marcus's first mandate was that everyone in the household, from Alexander to the cleaning staff to the cook, learn at least basic ASL. He created a visual guide with common household signs and posted them throughout the house. Hungry, thirsty, help, thank you, love, play, tired, bath, story. Some staff members embraced the challenge enthusiastically. Mrs. Chun, the cook, had been with the family for 5 years and had always felt sad about her inability to communicate with the twins. She threw herself into learning signs, practicing during her commute, and watching videos during her lunch break. Within 2 weeks, she could sign entire conversations about meals and cooking, and Emma and Ethan's faces would light up when they entered the kitchen and Mrs. Chun signed, "What shall we cook today?" Others were less enthusiastic. Mr. Harrison, the head butler who'd been with the family for 15 years, felt that learning a new language at 70 was too much to ask. After a tense conversation where he suggested that Alexander was being unreasonable, Alexander made a difficult decision. Mr. Harrison could retire with a generous severance package, but staying meant adapting to the new family culture. "This isn't optional anymore," Alexander had said firmly. "My children deserve to feel comfortable and understood in their own home. If you can't support that, then this isn't the right position for you anymore." Mr. Harrison chose to retire, and Alexander hired a younger house manager who was already fluent in ASL, having grown up with a deaf sibling. The transition was bumpy, but it sent a clear message. The needs of Emma and Ethan came first, and the entire household would adapt to them rather than expecting 2 3-year-olds to carry the burden of constant translation and adaptation. Alexander himself threw himself into learning with an intensity he usually reserved for business acquisitions. He attended the community center's beginner ASL class twice a week. He practiced with online videos for an hour every morning before work. He labeled items around his home office with their sign language equivalents. He even hired a deaf ASL tutor for private lessons on weekends. The transformation wasn't just linguistic, it was psychological. As Alexander learned more about deaf history and culture, he began to understand that his children were part of something much bigger than their immediate family. There was a rich heritage of deaf artists, deaf activists, deaf innovators who'd fought for recognition and rights. There were deaf universities, deaf theater companies, deaf sports leagues. One evening, Marcus showed Alexander a documentary about Gallaudet University, the world's only university designed specifically for deaf and hard-of-hearing students. Alexander watched footage of students signing animatedly with professors, participating in campus activities, graduating, and moving on to successful careers in every field imaginable. That could be Emma and Ethan someday, Marcus signed. Not because they've overcome their deafness, but because they've embraced it and been given the tools to thrive. Alexander felt something shift in his chest. Not sadness or grief, but hope. Real, genuine hope for his children's future that had nothing to do with medical interventions or trying to make them more like hearing children. The changes in Emma and Ethan were remarkable. With multiple adults in the household now able to communicate with them fluently, they became more confident, more expressive, more willing to take risks and try new things. Emma, who'd always been shy and reserved, started initiating conversations with staff members, asking questions about their work and telling elaborate stories about her imaginary adventures. Ethan, always the more outgoing twin, became a teacher himself, showing the adults the correct way to sign when they made mistakes. He took particular delight in teaching Alexander new signs, his small hands carefully shaping his father's larger ones into the right positions. The biggest change, however, was in Alexander and his children's relationship. The walls that had existed between them were slowly crumbling. Bedtime stories became a nightly ritual, with Alexander getting more confident in his signing and even starting to improvise and add his own creative flourishes. Weekend mornings were spent at the community center or at park playdates with other families they'd met there. One Saturday, Marcus organized a deaf culture celebration day at the Ashford house, inviting families from the community center and various deaf adults from the local area. Alexander had nervously agreed, unsure how his formal, elegant home would handle dozens of children and adults signing, laughing, and generally treating his space like a real home rather than a museum. The event was chaos in the best possible way. Children ran through the usually pristine hallways. Adults gathered in conversation clusters throughout the house and yard. Someone started a signing game in the living room. Mrs. Chun prepared a feast, consulting with deaf guests about their favorite foods and learning new signs for various dishes. Alexander found himself in the kitchen at one point, helping to prepare food alongside a deaf accountant named Sarah, a deaf teacher named James, and a deaf mechanic named Robert. None of them treated him like the billionaire owner of the house. They treated him like any other parent trying to figure things out. Through a combination of his improving ASL, patient interpretation from others, and a lot of charade-style gesturing, Alexander had real conversations. Sarah told him about her struggles convincing her family to learn ASL when she went deaf from meningitis at age 7. James shared stories about his experiences in mainstream schools versus deaf schools, helping Alexander understand the pros and cons of different educational approaches. Robert, who'd been deaf from birth and attended Gallaudet, talked about how deaf culture had given him a sense of identity and pride that had shaped his entire life. At one point during the party, Alexander stood on the back patio and watched Emma and Ethan playing with a group of deaf and hearing children. They were completely integrated into the group, not standing out as the deaf kids, but just being kids. Emma was explaining the rules of some game she'd invented, her hands flying through the air expressively. Ethan was making another child laugh with exaggerated facial expressions. Maya appeared at his side, following his gaze. "This is what I wanted you to see," she said softly. "This is what they could have all the time if they're raised in an environment that celebrates who they are." "I can't believe I almost missed this," Alexander said, his voice rough with emotion. "I was so focused on fixing them that I couldn't see they weren't broken." "You see it now," Maya pointed out. "That's what matters." Marcus joined them on the patio, signing, "You've come a long way in a few weeks. The change in this household is remarkable." "I had good teachers," Alexander signed back, his movements still slower than he'd like, but increasingly confident. "And motivation. My children deserve better than the father I've been." "You're being too hard on yourself," Marcus signed. "Parenting is a journey. Nobody gets it right from the start. What matters is that you're willing to learn and change." As the party continued into the evening, Alexander found himself in a conversation with Patricia from the community center and several other parents. They were discussing education options for deaf children, mainstream schools with interpreters, deaf schools where ASL was the primary language, hybrid models, homeschooling approaches. "What did you do?" Alexander asked a deaf couple whose teenage daughter had spoken at the community center about her experiences. "How did you decide?" The mother signed. "We tried mainstream first with interpreters. But Melissa was always the deaf girl in her class. She was isolated, different. So we switched her to a deaf school for middle school, and she blossomed. She found her people, her culture. Now she's confident enough to navigate both deaf and hearing worlds." The father added, "Every child is different. Some thrive in mainstream settings, Others need deaf education. The important thing is being flexible and listening to what your child needs, not what you think they should need. Alexander absorbed this wisdom, realizing how much he still had to learn. But for the first time, he didn't feel overwhelmed by his ignorance. He felt excited to learn, to grow, to become the father his children deserved. Late that night, after all the guests had left and the house was quiet again, Alexander found Emma and Ethan in their playroom, too excited to sleep. They were replaying the day's events, signing to each other about their favorite moments. Alexander settled on the floor beside them and signed. "Did you have fun today?" "Best day ever." Emma signed emphatically. "All our friends came to our house." Ethan added, "Should we do it again?" Alexander signed. "Maybe once a month?" Both children nodded enthusiastically, and then Emma signed something that made Alexander's heart squeeze. "Daddy, I love our home now. It feels like ours." The implication was clear. Before, it hadn't felt like theirs. It had been a beautiful prison where they existed but didn't truly live. Now, with these changes, it was becoming a real home. "I love you both so much," Alexander signed, pulling them into a hug. "And I'm going to keep making our home better for you. I promise." As he carried the sleepy children to bed a little while later, Alexander felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the temporary calm of a problem solved or a deal closed, but deep, soul-level peace that came from knowing he was finally on the right path. He thought about Lauren, and for the first time since her death, the memory didn't bring overwhelming grief. Instead, he felt her approval, as if she was somewhere watching and finally seeing him step up in the way she'd always wanted him to. "I'm trying, Lauren," he whispered into the darkness of the twins' room. "I'm finally trying. And I won't stop. I promise." 3 months after that first Saturday at the community center, the Ashford household had transformed into something unrecognizable from what it had been. The sterile, formal mansion had become a warm home where laughter, both heard and seen, was abundant. Visual alerts for doorbells and phones had been installed throughout the house. Family photos now lined the hallways, replacing expensive but impersonal artwork. The playroom had been expanded to include more tactile and visual activities designed with deaf children in mind. Most importantly, sign language had become the primary language of the home. Breakfast conversations were entirely in ASL. Staff meetings were conducted with interpreters present. Even the security team had learned basic signs so they could communicate with Emma and Ethan. Alexander had reduced his work hours significantly, much to his board's consternation. He'd promoted his very capable COO to handle day-to-day operations and repositioned himself as a chairman who focused on strategic vision rather than constant involvement. The company's stock had barely wavered, proving what he'd suspected. He hadn't been as indispensable as he'd thought. On this particular Saturday morning, Alexander was in the kitchen with Emma and Ethan, attempting to make pancakes. He'd gotten much better at cooking over the past few months, though he'd never match Mrs. Chen's expertise. The twins were helping, which meant there was flour everywhere and the batter had eggshells in it, but everyone was laughing. "Daddy, you forgot the vanilla." Emma signed, her small hands moving with increasing fluency. "You're right." Alexander signed back. "Can you get it from the pantry?" Emma scurried off importantly while Ethan climbed onto a stool to watch the pancakes cook. Alexander kept one hand on the boy's back to steady him while using his other hand to flip pancakes. He'd learned to do many things one-handed to keep his hands free for signing. Maya arrived for what had become their standing Saturday morning planning session. She was no longer just the nanny. Alexander had promoted her to Director of Family Services, a position he'd created specifically for her. Her salary had tripled, and she was now managing Marcus's schedule, coordinating with the twins' therapists and teachers, and serving as a liaison with the deaf community. "Big day today," Maya signed as she entered the kitchen, accepting a cup of coffee from Alexander. "Are you nervous?" "Terrified," Alexander signed back with a wry smile. "But good terrified. Excited terrified." Today was the day they were going to visit a potential school for Emma and Ethan, not just any school but a specialized deaf education center that used a bilingual approach, teaching in both ASL and English. The twins were only 3 and wouldn't start formal schooling for another year, but Alexander wanted to make informed decisions early. More significantly, today was the day Alexander was introducing Emma and Ethan to his parents, the twins' grandparents, for the first time since Lauren's funeral 3 years ago. Richard and Patricia Ashford had been calling more frequently over the past few months, having heard about the changes in Alexander's life through the family grapevine. Alexander had been avoiding the meeting, unsure how his traditional, hearing parents would react to the new family dynamics. But Marcus had convinced him it was important. "Your children need their extended family," he'd signed during one of their sessions. "And your parents need a chance to know their grandchildren. Don't let your assumptions about how they'll react prevent them from having that opportunity." So Alexander had invited them for lunch after the school visit, but before the evening playdate with families from the community center. He'd prepared by sending them resources about deaf culture, linking them to basic ASL tutorials, and firmly but politely explaining that if they wanted to be part of Emma and Ethan's lives, they needed to make an effort to communicate in the twins' language. The school visit went better than Alexander had dared hope. The Jefferson Deaf School was a revelation. Classrooms full of deaf children signing animatedly with deaf teachers, visual learning aids everywhere, and an atmosphere of complete normalcy. Here, deafness wasn't a disability, it was just how everyone was. The principal, Dr. Michelle Torres, herself deaf since birth, gave them a tour, explaining through an interpreter how the school's philosophy centered on celebrating deaf identity while preparing students to navigate both deaf and hearing worlds. "We don't believe in forcing children to choose between deaf and hearing cultures," Dr. Torres signed. "We teach them to be proud of who they are while also giving them tools to succeed in a world that is often designed without them in mind." Emma and Ethan were given a chance to visit a pre-K classroom, and Alexander watched through a window as his children immediately integrated with the other deaf children. Within minutes, they were playing a signing game, and the joy on their faces was unmistakable. "This is where they belong," Alexander signed to Maya, feeling both happiness for his children and a twinge of sadness that this world had existed all along and he'd been ignorant of it. "One of the places they belong," Maya corrected gently. "They also belong at the community center, at family dinners, at the playground. The goal isn't to separate them into a deaf world. It's to give them a strong foundation so they can move confidently through all worlds." Alexander nodded, understanding the distinction. It wasn't about segregation, it was about giving his children a home base, a place where they could simply be themselves without constant translation or accommodation. As they drove home from the school, Alexander's anxiety about his parents' visit increased. Richard Ashford was a retired federal judge, stern, traditional, and not known for his flexibility. Patricia Ashford was a society matriarch who valued appearances and propriety above most things. Neither had made much effort to learn about their grandchildren's deafness, sending birthday cards and checks but keeping physical and emotional distance. "What if they're judgmental?" Alexander signed to Maya at a stoplight, the twins drowsy in the back seat. "What if they say something that hurts Emma and Ethan?" "Then you protect your children," Maya signed back firmly. "You're not the same man you were 3 months ago, Alexander. You know what matters now. Trust yourself." His parents arrived exactly on time, chauffeured in their usual Blacktown car. Alexander watched from the window as his father helped his mother out of the vehicle, both of them dressed formally despite Alexander's request that they keep things casual. Some things never changed. He opened the door before they could ring the bell. He'd disabled the doorbell chime and relied on the visual alert system now, which he'd had to explain to his parents during their phone call planning this visit.
"Mother, father,
welcome." Alexander greeted them in spoken English, though he signed along with his words, a habit he'd developed over the past months. Patricia Ashford's eyes swept over her son, taking in his casual jeans and t-shirt, the flowers still dusting his shoulder from the morning's pancake adventure, the complete absence of his usual formal attire. Her expression was unreadable. Richard Ashford extended his hand formally, but then paused, looking at his son's hands. "Should I be doing something else? With my hands?" It was awkwardly phrased, but Alexander recognized it for what it was, an attempt, however clumsy. "You can sign hello like this," Alexander demonstrated, bringing his hand to his forehead in a small salute-like motion. His father copied the gesture carefully, and his mother followed suit. The movements were stiff and uncertain, but they were trying. That was something. Emma and Ethan appeared in the hallway, holding Maya's hands. They'd been warned about visitors and had dressed in their fancy clothes. Emma in a dress she'd picked out herself, Ethan in the button-down shirt he liked because it had dinosaurs on it. Patricia gasped softly. "They've grown so much," she said, her voice catching. "They were babies at the funeral, and now they're little people." "They're 3 years old," Alexander said, perhaps more sharply than intended. "You've missed a lot." There was a beat of uncomfortable silence, and then Richard said, "Yes, we have. We'd like to change that if you'll let us." "If they'll let us." Alexander felt Marcus's words echo in his mind. Give them a chance. Don't let assumptions prevent connection. They don't speak English, Alexander explained. They communicate in American Sign Language. If you want to talk to them, you'll need to sign. He'd sent his parents a document with basic signs, though he had no idea if they'd actually studied it. His mother pulled a piece of paper from her purse, the very document he'd sent, now worn and folded, with notes in the margins in his mother's precise handwriting. "We've been practicing," Patricia said, her aristocratic poise cracking slightly with nervousness. "I'm sure we'll make mistakes, but we wanted to try." Alexander felt something in his chest loosen. He knelt beside his children and signed. "Emma, Ethan, these are your grandparents. Grandma and Grandpa. They want to meet you." The twins looked uncertain, and Alexander didn't blame them. These strangers were invading their space, and children were perceptive about tension. Patricia knelt down slowly, her expensive skirt touching the floor without concern. She looked at her grandchildren, and Alexander saw tears forming in her eyes. Carefully consulting her paper, she signed, "Hello. I am Grandma. I am happy to meet you." The signs were clumsy, the grammar not quite right, but Emma recognized the effort. She signed back slowly, "Hello, Grandma." Ethan, always more outgoing, signed, "You have paper. Why?" Patricia laughed, a genuine sound Alexander hadn't heard from his mother in years. "Because I'm still learning," she signed, again checking her paper. "Like you learn new things. I'm learning to talk with my hands. I can teach you." Ethan signed enthusiastically. "I'm good, teacher." Richard watched this exchange with an expression Alexander couldn't quite read. Then his usually stoic father did something unexpected. He sat down on the floor, crossing his legs with a grace surprising for a 70-year-old man, and signed to Ethan. "Please teach me. I want to talk to you." What followed was one of the most touching and comical lessons Alexander had ever witnessed. Ethan, with all the seriousness of a 3-year-old teacher, demonstrated various signs while Richard copied them dutifully. Patricia and Emma joined in, and soon all 4 of them were sitting on the floor of the foyer, signing and laughing as Ethan corrected his grandfather's hand shapes with gentle patience. Maya caught Alexander's eye and signed, "See? You worried for nothing." But Alexander could see the tears on his mother's face, the tightness in his father's jaw that suggested suppressed emotion. This wasn't easy for them. It was probably terrifying, actually, stepping into this unfamiliar world where they couldn't rely on their usual social skills and polished personas. Lunch was a revelation. Mrs. Chun had prepared a spread of favorites, and the table conversation was a mixture of signing, speaking, and patient interpretation. Richard and Patricia made mistakes constantly, wrong signs, forgotten vocabulary, confused grammar, but they kept trying. More importantly, they engaged directly with Emma and Ethan, not through Alexander as an intermediary. "Tell me about your favorite toy," Patricia signed to Emma, consulting her notes for favorite and toy. Emma launched into an elaborate story about her stuffed butterfly, her hands flying as she described its adventures. Patricia clearly only understood about half of it, but she watched with rapt attention, asking clarifying questions and expressing delight at each development in the story. Richard, meanwhile, was deep in conversation with Ethan about dinosaurs, a topic both were passionate about, though for very different reasons. Richard was pulling up pictures on his phone to show Ethan different species, and Ethan was teaching his grandfather the signs for each dinosaur name. At one point, Patricia turned to Alexander and said in spoken English, "I've been a fool. Richard and I both have. We told ourselves we were giving you space to grieve, to adjust. But really, we were hiding from something we didn't understand. We let our discomfort keep us from our grandchildren. Why now?" Alexander asked. "Why are you suddenly making an effort?" "Because we heard you were," Richard answered, also switching to spoken English while the twins were distracted with their activities. "Your mother ran into Jennifer Morrison at a charity event. You remember her? Her son was in your class at Harvard. Anyway, Jennifer mentioned seeing you at some deaf community center event, said you were involved in something called deaf culture, that you'd become quite the advocate. It made us curious," Patricia continued. "So we started researching,
Reading.
watching videos about sign language and deaf history. And we realized we'd been treating Emma and Ethan's deafness like some shameful family secret. We were wrong." "I was wrong too," Alexander admitted. "For a long time. I'm still learning." "We'd like to learn with you," Richard said. "If you'll let us. We've already signed up for an ASL class at the community college.
Twice a week.
Patricia and I haven't taken a class together since law school." Alexander felt emotion welling up. His parents, formal, distant, traditional, were signing up for community college classes to communicate with their grandchildren. It was more than he'd dared hope for. The afternoon passed with surprising ease. When families from the community center arrived for the planned playdate, Richard and Patricia stayed, watching with fascination as the house filled with signing children and adults. Alexander saw his father in deep conversation via interpreter with Marcus about deaf education, taking notes like a student. His mother was learning children's songs in ASL from one of the other mothers, her movements awkward but determined. At one point, Emma brought her grandmother over to meet her best friend Sarah and Sarah's deaf mother, Jennifer. Patricia signed her greeting carefully, and Jennifer signed back warmly, thanking Patricia for making the effort to learn. Later, Jennifer pulled Alexander aside and signed, "Your mother asked me about deaf adult role models for Emma. She wanted to know how to help Emma grow up confident." That's a good sign. She's thinking about the future, about deaf identity, not just about fixing a problem. As the day wound down and the guests left, Richard and Patricia prepared to leave as well. But before they got in their car, Patricia pulled Alexander into a tight hug, something she hadn't done since he was a child. "Thank you for giving us another chance," she said, "and for showing us what's really important. We've spent so much of our lives focused on appearances and status, and we almost missed the chance to know two incredible children." "They are incredible," Alexander agreed. "I almost missed them too." "But you didn't," Richard said firmly. "You recognized your mistake, and you changed. That takes courage. I'm proud of you, son. More proud than I've been of any of your business successes." After his parents left, Alexander found Maya on the back patio, watching Emma and Ethan play in the yard with a few children whose parents had stayed late. The evening sun cast long shadows across the grass, and the children's laughter, silent but visible in their expressions and movements, filled the air. "Thank you," Alexander signed to Maya. "For everything. For that first day, when you were dancing with them. For opening my eyes. For staying patient with me while I figured things out. For turning this house into a home." "I didn't do that," Maya signed back. "You did. I just showed you what was already there, a father who loves his children and needed help finding his way to them." "I couldn't have done it without you," Alexander insisted. "You're not just an employee, Maya. You're family. The twins think of you that way, and so do I." Maya's eyes shone with tears. "They're the best thing that's happened to me too. After Miguel died, I thought I'd never find that kind of connection again. But Emma and Ethan, they filled a hole I didn't know how to name." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the children play. Then Alexander signed something he'd been thinking about for weeks, but hadn't had the courage to say. "I've been thinking about the future," he signed. "About what happens when Emma and Ethan start school, when they get older, when their needs change. And I realize I don't want to navigate that without you. I'd like to formalize your position in this family, not just as director of family services, but as legal guardian if anything ever happens to me. I want you to know that you'll always have a place here, that you'll always be part of their lives." Maya's hand flew to her mouth, tears spilling over. "Alexander, I don't know what to say." "Say yes," he signed, echoing her words to him months ago. "Say you'll stay, through all of it, the good days and the hard days. Say you'll help me raise these kids to be confident, proud, happy adults who know they're loved." "Yes," Maya signed, her hands trembling. "Of course yes. Always yes." They hugged, no longer employer and employee, but family in the truest sense. When they pulled back, Emma and Ethan had noticed the embrace and came running over, demanding to know what was happening. "Big news," Alexander signed to them. "Maya is going to be part of our family officially. Forever. She'll always be here with us. Forever." Emma signed, her eyes wide. "Forever," Maya confirmed. Both twins launched themselves at Maya, hugging her with the fierce intensity only children possess. Over their heads, Maya met Alexander's eyes and mouthed, "Thank you." That night, as Alexander tucked the twins into bed, Emma signed a question. "Daddy, are you happy now?" The simplicity of it nearly undid him. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm very happy." "Are you?" "Very happy," Emma signed. "This is the best home ever." "The best family ever," Ethan added, already half asleep. Alexander kissed both their foreheads and signed, "I love you," a sign he'd learned on that first day and now used dozens of times daily. As he left their room, he paused in the doorway and looked back at his sleeping children. 3 months ago, he'd been a man lost in grief, hiding behind work, disconnected from the most important people in his life. He'd had everything money could buy, but nothing that truly mattered. Now, his house was full of noise and chaos and joy. His calendar was marked with ASL classes and community center events and playdates rather than board meetings and investor calls. His hands were learning a new language, and his heart was learning how to be fully present. He was still a billionaire. His company was still successful. But now he was also a father, really, truly a father, to 2 incredible children who were teaching him more about courage, resilience, and joy than any business venture ever had. And he had Maya, who'd taken a job as a nanny and become so much more, a friend, a teacher, a partner in the most important work of his life. As Alexander walked to his own room, he caught his reflection in the hallway mirror. He looked different, less polished perhaps, but more real. There were smile lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. His shoulders were relaxed in a way they hadn't been in years. He pulled out his phone and looked at photos from the day, his mother learning signs on the floor with Ethan, his father laughing at something Emma had signed, the house full of families, Maya and the twins covered in pancake batter from this morning. This was what life was supposed to look like. Not perfect, not polished, not controlled, but real, messy, joyful, full of connection and love. His phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. "Proud of you. Your children are lucky to have you." Alexander typed back, "I'm the lucky one. They saved me." And it was true. Emma and Ethan, in their silent world, had taught him to listen with his eyes and speak with his heart. They'd shown him that the most important things in life couldn't be bought or scheduled or managed. They had to be lived, experienced, felt. He thought about that day months ago when he'd stood frozen in the doorway, watching Maya dance with his children. He'd been terrified then, of failing, of not being enough, of the vulnerability that connection required.
He was still scared sometimes.
He still made mistakes, still had moments of frustration when communication was hard, still worried about whether he was doing right by his children. But now he knew something essential. Love wasn't about being perfect. It was about showing up, trying, learning, and never giving up. It was about being present in the moment, celebrating who your children actually were rather than mourning who you thought they should be. Emma and Ethan didn't need a perfect father. They needed a present one. And finally, after too many missed opportunities, Alexander was learning to be both there and aware, not just physically present but emotionally engaged. As he got ready for bed, Alexander did something he'd started doing every night. He journaled in a video diary, signing his thoughts and feelings in ASL. It was practice, but it was also documentation, a record he could show Emma and Ethan someday of his journey from ignorance to understanding, from distance to connection. Today was a good day, he signed to the camera. My parents met their grandchildren, really met them, not just saw them. Maya agreed to be part of our family forever. And I realized something important. I'm not the man I was 6 months ago. I'm better. Not because I've achieved more or earned more or accomplished more, but because I've loved more. I've opened myself up to connection in ways I was too afraid to do before. He paused, collecting his thoughts. If you ever watch this, Emma and Ethan, I want you to know something. Your deafness didn't make you less, it made me more. More patient, more present, more human. You taught me to see the world differently, to value connection over control, to understand that the best conversations happen in silence. He signed "I love you" to the camera, then turned it off. As Alexander lay in bed, he could hear, feel, really, the quiet hum of his house. Not silent, despite the lack of spoken words. The house was full of life, full of love, full of possibility. And for the first time in 3 years, since Lauren's death, since the terrifying diagnosis of his children's deafness, since the long nights of grief and guilt and fear, Alexander felt at peace. He'd found his way home. Not to a place, but to his children, to himself, to the life he was meant to live. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be hard conversations about education, difficult moments when communication broke down, times when he felt inadequate or overwhelmed. But he wouldn't face them alone. He had Emma and Ethan, brave and beautiful in their silent world. He had Maya, wise and patient and full of love. He had Marcus, teaching them all to navigate between cultures. He had a whole community of deaf families ready to support and guide them. And most importantly, he had the knowledge that he was finally the father he'd always wanted to be, not perfect but present. Not fearless, but willing to be vulnerable. Not distant, but deeply, irrevocably connected. As sleep overtook him, Alexander's last thought was of that moment months ago, Maya dancing with his children, all 3 of them laughing in a bubble of pure joy. He'd been frozen then, stunned by the scene before him. Now he wasn't frozen anymore. Now he was dancing too.